sponsored by the United Way of Hastings, the Ruth and George Doffing Charitable Gift Fund, Hastings Public School Foundation, Friends of the Public Library, Hastings AAUW, School District 200, and the Scrapping Time. The goal of Hastings Reads is to bring us together as a community through literature. And tonight we're gathered together to hear from one of our nation's best authors, Tim O'Brien. Tim O'Brien is a native of Minnesota. He grew up in Worthington. He went to college in St. Paul at Macalester. And after he graduated from Macalester, he was drafted into the Vietnam War. He's written numerous award-winning novels, many of them about the experiences of soldiers in the Vietnam War. And The Things They Carried is universally praised as being the most powerful piece of literature about the experiences our soldiers had in Vietnam. The Hastings Reads theme this year is The Stories We Tell, and O'Brien's novel, The Things They Carried, was an obvious choice. He's a master storyteller, which is why 3 of his novels and 5 of his stories are taught here at Hastings High School in grades 9 through 12. Earlier today, students filled this auditorium to hear Tim O'Brien talk to them about the experiences he's had as a writer, to give them advice with writing, and tonight he will share his stories with you. Please welcome Tim O'Brien.
Thank you. It's really great to be back in Minnesota. I haven't been here in, 10 years or so. My mom and dad lived down in Worthington up until about 10 years ago, and I come here quite often. So when Carrie invited me, it was a thrill not just to be invited to speak, but a thrill to go back to my hometown, Worthington, to see my brother, to reacquaint myself with your accent, and my former accent, which I think I've pretty much lost now. This afternoon, I told a group of high school students I was talking to in this very auditorium that although I'm probably best known for my books about Vietnam, I did not then and still don't think of myself as a soldier. I was a draftee, and it's not quite the same thing as somebody who voluntarily goes over and does it all. I think of myself as a writer. And even as a kid growing up in Worthington, I had dreamed about someday being a writer. I had the experience in Worthington of playing a kind of crappy shortstop for the Ben Franklin Little League team. I couldn't field, I couldn't hit, couldn't run, couldn't throw, otherwise pretty good shortstop. And I remember a day so vividly that made me into a writer as much as anything that happened to me in Vietnam. It was in the heat of August. I'd come off the baseball field, off a particularly abysmal performance, booting ground balls and striking out. Trudging home thinking, I'm not going to be a professional baseball player. I just don't have it in me. And on the way home, I passed what was then the Nobles County Library, which was one of these old Carnegie libraries that used to just dot the Midwest. There are a few still left, I think, but ours is gone in Worthington. In any case, I passed the library and went inside, feeling really dejected. And I went to the children's section and found a book called Larry the Little League that I read in, maybe an hour. It's a short juvenile, book for kids. And in this book, the kid Larry could do everything I couldn't do. Kid could hit, run, field, and throw. He was a great baseball player. I remember going over to the librarian and asking for a pad of paper and a pencil, which he gave me. And over the course of the next hour and a half or so, I wrote the first real novel of my life, or what I thought it was a novel. I was 9 years old. But it seemed like a novel to me. It was probably 30 pages long, handwritten. The title of which was Timmy of the Little League. It was a direct ripoff of Larry the Little League in every regard. I mean, copying sentences and just plugging my name in. Wherever Larry was, I put Timmy. I remember on page 10 or so of this book, the Timmy character got the game-winning hit in the Worthington, Minnesota Little League playoff, where Ben Franklin team we beat up on, the Kiwanis team, like 10-0. I scored all 10 runs. I was pitcher and catcher simultaneously. I mean, I'd throw the ball and I'd be there waiting for it. In the middle of the book, say page 20, the Worthington Ben Franklin team came up to the Twin Cities where we beat Edina 50-0. Again, I scored all 50 runs. And at the end of the book, at page 30, a book my mom still has, and she threatens to release to the New York Times if I misbehave, if I'm arrested for doing cocaine or something, she'll turn this book over to him. At the end of the book, the Worthington, Minnesota Ben Franklin team goes to the Little League World Series, which is played in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where we beat up on Taiwan. I mean, 10,000-0. We just slaughtered it. Well, this is an example of what I mean about when I was a kid, I really wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how to do it, and all I knew was I loved books and wanted to take a shot at it. So what I thought tonight, see, it's this afternoon, around noon, sort of take your pick. When I was talking to the high school students, I almost entirely talked about Vietnam. And I wanted tonight to switch gears to the other half of my personality, which is the writing part. And to talk about writing through a little bit of just conversation with you and also through little stories. There's going to be one naughty word in this talk tonight. So I'm going to raise my hand about 10 seconds before it appears, okay, like this. So those of you who don't like bad words, plug your ears up. You can't take it out. It has to be in the story. So get ready to get some ear stoppers ready or your earmuffs out. And I'll warn you, if I remember. My sons, Timmy and Tad, are both fans of Winnie the Pooh. And they've taken lately to wearing tails. At our local Walmart and occasionally at church, the boys sport lengths of clothesline dangling from their trousers. They prowl the neighborhood, trailing an assortment of ribbons, coat hangers, telephone cords, fishing line, belts, drapery tassels, and electrical extension cords. People notice things have gotten out of hand. Alas, we have become a family of tales. And although I'm embarrassed to make this confession, even my wife and I have been persuaded to spruce up our fashion acts. Meredith jogs in a tail. I write in a tale. Just a couple of days ago, in a most undignified moment, I answered the doorbell, having forgotten the slinky jiggling restlessly at my buttocks. Imagine the judgments taking shape in the eyes of the UPS man. Our household seems caught up in a kind of reverse evolution, tumbling backward through the millennia, alighting in an age in which the ancestral tale was as common and quietly useful as, say, the appendix or the tonsil. Like our tree-dwelling relatives, the OBrien tribe has grown comfortable with its tales. We groom them, we miss them at bath time, we view their absence in our fellow man with pity, with suspicion. Now, as I sit here with my coffee at the kitchen table, I find myself wondering if something about this tale business might smack of the unwholesome, even of the aberrant or fanatical. Imagination, of course, is a precious human gift. Yet even so, I worry about the future. I entertain visions of little Tad, who will soon turn 4, awaiting his bride at the marriage altar with a large powdered tail quivering aloft. And I'm not alone in such irrational fears. Meredith won't admit to it, but over the past several weeks, she has been stealing into the boys' bedroom at night, secretly pulling back the sheets to check for the first hairy sproutings of the real McCoy. The shadows of childhood can darken our adult lives. That much I know is a certainty. And what parent would not be concerned that present fantasy might somehow influence distant fact? Already the imaginary has embedded itself in the real world. At preschool soccer games, little Timmy is impeded by the awkward mechanics of the Tigger hop. 4 strides and a bounce, 4 strides and a bounce. Spectators gawk. Coaches squint at me. I feel the chill of a silent accusation. What kind of father are you? I've tried, God knows, to reason with the boys. I've used guile, bribery, outright deceit. Santa Claus hates tales. Last night I tried again. Pretending can be a good thing, I told the boys at bedtime. But sometimes pretending can get you in trouble. It can be dangerous. Young Tad had already drifted off, but Timmy looked up at me with suspicion. Is this one of your silly stories? Not silly at all, I said. And then I launched into a hastily improvised tale about a little boy who couldn't stop pretending, always talking to a make-believe dog, always eating make-believe pancakes. After a while, I said, this little boy couldn't separate what was real from what wasn't. It landed him in all kinds of trouble. But I thought make-believe was supposed to be fun, Timmy said. Well, yes, of course it is, I told him. And then a crucial question occurred to me. Do you know what pretending is? For what seemed a long, long time, I listened to the whir of a 5-year-old's mind in motion. Well, actually, Timmy said, using his favorite and only 4-syllable word. Actually, I guess it's like when you go away on trips. Sometimes I dream about you. I dream about how you'll come home from the airport and bring me surprises and play with me. I get sad when you go away, and so I pretend you're not gone. Was that bad? I told him no. It wasn't bad. When you go away, Timmy said, sometimes I write your name in the sandbox. I pretend you're pushing me on a swing or making funny faces at me. I nodded. The whole issue of tales had suddenly dissolved into something pale and something trivial. The thought struck me that I should begin cutting back on the travel. Maybe cancel that trip to Hastings. Fewer airports. More conversations such as this one. I kissed the boys goodnight. What about your story, Timmy said. What happened to that little boy who couldn't stop pretending? Nothing bad, I said. He grew up. I left the bedroom and went off in search of Xanax. Well, this little anecdote is offered tonight as kind of a prelude to, but also as an illustration of what I want to talk about, which is the role of imagination in the writing of fiction, the role of pretending. In general, this topic is born out of writing workshops, in which I've noticed almost always to my alarm that classroom discussion in high schools or even in college workshops that have to do with writing almost always revolves around issues of verisimilitude or believability or accuracy. Declarations such as these abound. I didn't believe in that character. I need to know more about that character's background. I can't see that character's face. I don't understand why that character would behave so stupidly or violently or whatever. Now, these are obviously all legitimate questions, but for me, as a reader, just an ordinary reader of books, the more dangerous problem with bad stories is almost always a lot less complex. I'm bored. And I would remain bored even if the story were packed with pages of detail aimed at establishing believability. I believe in the story, yeah, but I still hate it. To provide background and physical description and all the rest is vital to fiction, but it's vital only insofar as such detail is in the service of a richly imagined story, rather than in the service of good botany or good philosophy or good geography. Let's say, for example, that a story is set in Nigeria. No matter how much detail is offered to help me see and smell and hear Nigeria, if the story itself doesn't surprise me or delight me or enchant me in some way, all that detail is mere information, which better belongs in a travelogue or an encyclopedia entry. I might be wholly convinced of the setting, yet wholly sedated by the story. Or, to say it a different way, the research might be a resounding success, but the drama a dismal failure. The failure almost always is one of imagination. What if, for example, one were to tell a bedtime story to a kid that went like this? Batman weighed 188 pounds. His hair was black. His complexion was fair. Young Batman grew up in Sioux City, Iowa, where he spent an unhappy and decidedly disturbed childhood. His grandfather was well known in town as the man who had invented the machine that lays down lane stripes on highways all across America. Batman's mother was an insomniac. She could sew pretty well. She loved a good pork chop. The church Batman attended was made of limestone. His school was a brick structure. The family car was an Oldsmobile. Well, I could pile on other such detail for pages, even towards infinity. I could go on forever. But my sons would probably finally end up demanding that something happen. Some unusual and dramatic event. Pork chops and highway stripes only go so far for a kid. For a child, and maybe for an adult as well. A better story, although not a great story, might begin this way. When Batman was 6 years old, he grew a big, bushy tail. Often it popped right out of his pants. This was embarrassing, of course, especially in a place like Sioux City, Iowa, where tails were out of fashion among Midwestern kids. As a result, Batman had no friends. Kids hated him. Kids laughed at him. One day after school, as Batman was walking home, his tail dragging in the mud behind him, he looked back and saw that he had painted a long, dark stripe on the center of the road. His grandfather, who happened to be driving by, took note of this, and of how that stripe neatly divided the road into two separate halves. What a wonderful way to prevent collisions, thought Batman's grandfather. If only that stripe were yellow. That night at dinner, Batman's grandfather talked with great excitement about building a machine that would replicate what he had witnessed on the road that day. We'll make millions, maybe billions, said Batman's grandfather. We can finally get out of this cruddy town. No one else at the dinner table seemed impressed. Pass the pork chop, said Batman's mother. But the next morning, undaunted, the grandfather tied young Batman to the rear bumper of the family Oldsmobile and handed him a can of yellow paint. Just dip in your tail whenever it runs dry, said the grandfather. A nice straight line. And so, for miles and miles, Batman painted a neat yellow stripe up and down the streets of Sioux City, Iowa, past limestone churches and past brick schoolhouses. Not a month later, the city's accident rate had dropped dramatically. Batman suddenly had friends. A parade was held in his honor. Sioux City, Iowa became known, and is still known today, as the safest city in the safest county in the safest state in America. And little Batman had his first sweet taste of of what it was to be a hero, almost a superhero. Although to this day his tail remains an appendage he takes great care to disguise. You probably haven't even noticed it. Now, I certainly don't claim literary merit for this example, but I do think that a kid would pay attention. A chuckle here, a raised eyebrow there. In general, it's my belief that informational detail, like limestone churches, brick schoolhouses, and Oldsmobiles, and pork chops, and stripes, that all that informational detail has to be in the service of the story, and not merely in the service of authenticity. To be memorable and to have dramatic impact, detail has to function actively within the fabric of the story. The detail has to be the story. Otherwise, the author's hard work goes into a reader's recycle bin of forgettable clutter. Now, when I talk about a well-imagined story, I mean a whole bunch of things. But I want to start by listing a few things that a well-imagined story is not, at least in my opinion as a writer. A well-imagined story is not generic. It hasn't been lifted off the shelf at your local literary Walmart. A well-imagined story is not predictable, or at least not wholly predictable. A well-imagined story is not melodramatic. It doesn't rely on purely villainous villains or purely heroic heroes. A well-imagined story does not use formula in place of inventiveness. It does not substitute cliché for a fresh vision. A well-imagined story does not rely on coincidence or happenstance for its dramatic effects. A character named Lance, let's say, who just happens to be walking by at the very instant another character named Brandy, the unrequited love of Lance's life, emerges from the doctor's office with her stinking new diaphragm. A well-imagined story does not rev up bland, everyday events with lurid, purpley, overwrought language. For example, a well-imagined story would not include a sentence such as this one. With an explosive, rocket-like thrust of his legs, Lance jumped for joy at the heartwarming vision of Brandy's snow-white diaphragm. More positively, and I think maybe more helpfully, I could try to suggest what a well-imagined story does mean to me when pretending really works. Above all, a well-imagined story is always organized around extraordinary human events, unexpected and startling human behaviors, which in turn help to illuminate the commonplace and the ordinary. In your daily life, you would not say to a drinking companion, "Hey, here's a great story for you. Yesterday morning I ate Cheerios. They were pretty good. Then I went off to work. It was boring. I left the office at 5 o'clock sharp. That night I ate a steak. Not a great steak, but a pretty darn good steak. I went to bed about 9. Very quickly, if you were to tell that story to a friend over a cup of coffee, or a Coke, or a beer, I think your drinking mate might soon leave in search of more interesting company. A better story, though not necessarily a good one, might begin this way. Yesterday morning, over my usual bowl of Cheerios, I was alarmed to note that the Cheerios were shaped not as standard circles, but as semicircles, as if someone had used a surgical scalpel to slice each individual Cheerio precisely in half. Odd, I thought. And odder still, these particular Cheerios tasted only half as delicious as they had once tasted. And odder yet, I found myself half hungry at work that morning, half wishing for a bowl of Cheerios. My hunger was soon tempered, though, by the disturbing realization that I was now but half a man. Well, again, I don't claim literary merit for the example, but I do claim pretty emphatically that the second opening is one to which most of you will pay attention. Your drinking companion might frown and ask, half a man how? That last sentence begs for a next sentence. The last event begs for a next event. Now, as a qualifier, I want to be clear that when I talk about the need for extraordinary human behavior, I don't mean to tell you that a successful story has to contain elements of the bizarre, or the supernatural, or the fantastic. Although by temperament, I'm disposed to what is called magical realism. That is to say, I like miracles to happen in the stories I write. I want to have the dead sit up and tell us what it's like to be dead. I'm disposed to that kind of writing. But even so, I can admire and even love the fiction of a Cheever or a Hemingway or a Fitzgerald and many, many other masters of realism. What I am trying to suggest tonight is that even the most realistic story succeeds by reaching way beyond the ordinary, way beyond the banal, and way beyond the expected. Even if your goal is to depict ordinary human beings in ordinary human settings, the story must still find striking and dramatic and unexpected ways to accomplish this. Something, somehow, must strike the reader as extraordinary enough to continue reading. And certainly in the work of those masterful realists I listed a second ago, you will find on every page examples of what I mean by extraordinary human behavior, incidents of surprise and delight. To vividly imagine and to vividly render extraordinary human events is the hard-lifting, heavy-duty, day-by-day, unending labor of a fiction writer. To close your eyes and imagine something fresh, something new, something that wasn't borrowed from last night's rerun of Starsky and Hutch or Laverne and Shirley, something that's all yours and doesn't belong to some other writer. That's the hard work, not the making of sentences, but to imagine a story that hasn't been read before. Another element of a well-imagined story, in my opinion anyway, is a sense of thematic weight or importance that a story carries with it, a kind of heft or gravitas that gives it meaning and makes it endure. Inventing just a nifty, extraordinary set of behaviors for our characters isn't enough. A fiction writer is challenged to find import in those behaviors. In that Cheerios example I offered a moment ago, there is at least a small, dry germ of thematic weight in the line, I was now but half a man. Without a turn such as that one, and without the additional work of extending it into a larger dramatic whole, that anecdote is nothing but a trivial, clever little riff on halfness. Nothing more than that. And cleverness, I'm afraid, in the end, is a sorry substitute for thematic weight. To imagine a next bit of action that's at once surprising to the reader, but also natural, somehow fitting, that reaches into the deeper chambers of the human heart, is among the fiction writer's greatest challenges. This morning, or this afternoon, at this high school, I offered an example that I actually wrote down of what I mean by trying to come up with that next bit of action that is natural to the story, but also surprising, somehow unexpected. "I love you," Jack says to Jill, which is action. and which leads Jill to say, "I love you too." Another bit of action, which leads to an exchange of wedding vows. Another bit of action, which leads to Jack and Jill sailing off on their honeymoon aboard a rented yacht to the South Pacific. Another bit of action, which leads to the yacht springing a sudden leak. Another bit of action, which leads to the yacht's swift sinking, which leads Jack to appropriate for himself the only life jacket aboard the yacht, which leads Jill to fetch into her lungs more than a pail of water, which leads Jack to contemplate as he floats upon the vast Pacific the contours of his pitiful and cowardly life. Betrayal, remorse, inconstancy. Here is the kind of resonant thematic material that a serious novel finds tempting. A plot possibility that occurred to me after my talk. On the third night of their honeymoon, 400 miles west of Honolulu, might Jack discover a small but indisputable tail coiled at his lovely new bride's behind? Ooh. How these things strike me. Well, another example of what I mean by gravitas, or thematic weight, comes out of my own life. A story that I intend to sit down someday and to write. In June of, I think it was 2004 or 5, my wife Meredith and I were attending a writers' conference in the mountains of Tennessee called the Swanee Writers' Conference, where we were eagerly awaiting the utterance of my first son's first word. One of us was betting on the word daddy. That was me. The other was betting on the word mommy. That was Meredith. Well, 3 days into that conference, little Timmy delivered. He looked up from a toy rattlesnake. We live in Texas. And he said, shockingly, "'Tis a tale told by an idiot." Meredith and I were astonished. We were frightened. Immediately, we packed the kid up and hauled him down to the Swanee Health Facility. A kindly young nurse was on duty, probably 30 years old, 32. She enthroned little Timmy on an examining table and said, "All right, what's the trouble, little guy?" Timmy just stared at her. Suspiciously, I thought. And after a moment, he said, "'Tis a tale told by an idiot." The nurse, like Meredith and I, was taken aback. She checked the boy's vitals, she excused herself, and she went to a telephone. Apparently, a doctor was on call. Over the next several minutes, I could overhear bits and pieces of the nurse's end of the conversation. You know, a phrase here, a phrase there. The general temper of which was alarm. I'm quite certain I heard the nurse whisper, "These goddamn writers' conferences." Only minutes later, no doubt sped by curiosity, the doctor himself soon appeared. A white-haired, courtly, convivial gentleman dressed for the game of golf. The man smiled and clapped his hands. "So what's the story here?" he said. Timmy muttered, "'Tis a tale told by an idiot." The kid now seemed pleased with himself. Well, medical procedures ensued, probings of the tongue and the ear. But in the end, the physician seemed as puzzled as any of us. He scratched his head. Our son, he finally told us, was not sick, at least not strictly speaking. He explained to us that 1-year-olds were well known to have as their first utterance not just a single word, such as daddy, but, in fact, 2 or 3 words, such as bye-bye daddy, or hi there daddy, or other such simple constructions. Your son, the doctor said, has merely tacked on a few extra syllables. Well, yes, said Meredith, but those are famous syllables. The physician pooh-poohed this. He assured us that the abnormality was far from life-threatening. It wasn't cancer. It wasn't polio. And so, after he prescribed a sedative for Meredith and me, we departed the dispensary. Well, that evening, as any parent in this audience can imagine, Meredith and I shot a good many oblique looks at our little kid. Proudly, yeah, but also with a measure of anxiety. It was clear from this point on that it would be wise to start watching our tongues. If the boy could pick up on a phrase from Shakespeare, he could certainly master the word. Moreover, I must now admit to something infantile in my own personality. As that evening wore on, I found myself increasingly disappointed, and then outright irritated, that my own son's first utterance came from the imagination of a competing writer. At one point, while Meredith set up the video camera, I knelt down beside young Timmy and whispered to him, "First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross carried letters from a girl named Martha, a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey." Well, once again, I don't claim this little anecdote represents a piece of literature, but I do believe that in certain sympathetic hands, like those of a Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, or a Donald Barthelme, or the Brothers Grimm, or any other writer with a sensibility suited to the comical and to the grotesque, might make an interesting piece of fiction out of this little anecdote. I myself, in fact, might try it someday, adding, subtracting, taking what is now a trifling little sketch off into the realm of a full story. What I would not do, almost certainly, is play any longer with Shakespeare. I'd take the story somewhere else, virtually to any other somewhere else. I'd try to surprise myself. I'd try to find some new narrative direction for the story to take, away from Shakespeare and towards something else. And while trying to sustain something of the humor, I'd also begin keeping an eye peeled for gravitas, or thematic weight, hoping that the tale might elevate itself above the eccentric or the entertainingly slight. I would trust those first paragraphs, the ones I just read to you, to carry me toward that next dimension. What if late that same night, Timmy were to cry out in his sleep, "Alas, Babylon"? Or what if the next morning, perched in his high chair, he were suddenly to bay, "I ain't nothing but a hound dog"? Or what if a month later, at a sunny beach along the ocean, he were to whisper, "Bye-bye, Daddy," and then toddle off into the water and sink beneath the waves? To seek gravitas, or a thematic weight, is to seek fresh insight into the world we all live in, to see something new, or illuminate. And of course, to seek fresh insight is to avoid the predictable, the familiar, the wholly logical, the already written, the movie you saw last week, the bestseller you read last month, the classic you almost finished back in college. To trust a story is to trust, as I said earlier, your own imagination, and not the imagination of some literary predecessor. Also, if I were to go forward with this little Timmy story, and now thinking about it, why not? If I were to go forward, I would soon begin fretting over little issues of storytelling craft, how to tell the story. Beyond anything else, I would do nothing to explain how a 1-year-old came to declaim a famous Shakespearean phrase. That utterance would simply be, the way Thumbelina simply is small. It's not explained how she got small, or parents didn't feed her enough, how she didn't like her broccoli and therefore didn't grow up. She's just small. and is offered as a kind of given, the way in, say, Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa simply is a bug. I will grant you, a baby citing or reciting a phrase from Shakespeare is on its face pretty far-fetched, pretty mysterious. But it seems to me no more far-fetched and no more mysterious than, say, the existence of human love, or the existence of our solar system, or Muhammad Atta flying an airplane into a Manhattan skyscraper. Those things seem pretty far-fetched and pretty mysterious too, don't they? Up to this point, I realize I have not addressed the topic many of you probably came here thinking you'd hear about. Until this point, I haven't uttered the word Vietnam. A long, long time ago, I was a soldier. And as I told you earlier, even back then, I didn't think of myself as one. I thought of myself more as the guy in the baseball cap standing before you tonight, a writer. And yet, even when I'm writing about Vietnam, the stuff I talked about tonight is what dominates every second of my writing life. Not memories of Vietnam, not war stuff, but instead, how best to tell a story that will somehow make you chuckle, or bring a tear to your eye, or make your stomach vibrate as you hear about the war. I want to give you one example. It's only like a minute and a half long, out of the things they've carried, of a passage where I was challenged to write something where I was imagining out of whole cloth a scene so that you would feel something of what I felt back in Vietnam all those years ago. There was a story about how Kurt Lemon had gone trick-or-treating on Halloween, a dark, spooky night. And so Kurt Lemon put on a ghost mask and painted up his body all different colors and crept out across a paddy to a sleeping village. Almost stark naked, the story goes, just boots and balls and an M16. And in the dark, Lemon went from hooch to hooch, ringing doorbells, he called it. And a few hours later, when he slipped back into the perimeter, he had a whole sack full of goodies to share with his pals. Candles and jaw sticks, and a pair of black pajamas, and statuettes of the smiling Buddha. That was the story, anyway. Other versions were much more elaborate, full of descriptions and scraps of dialogue. My friend Rat Kylie liked to spice the story up with extra details. See, what happens is, it's like 4 a.m, and Lemon, he sneaks into a hooch with that weird ghost mask on. Everybody's asleep, right? So he wakes up this cute little mama-san, tickles her foot. Hey, mama-san, he goes, real soft like. Hey, mama-san, trick or treat. Should have seen her face about freaks. I mean, there's this buck-naked ghost standing there, and he's got this M16 up against her ear, and he goes, hey, mama-san, trick or treat. Then he takes off her PJs, strips her right down, sticks the pajamas in his sack, tucks her into bed, and heads to the next hooch. Pausing a moment, Rat Kylie would grin, shake his head. Honest to God, he'd say, trick or treat. Kurt Lemon. There was one class act. To listen to that story, especially as Kurt Lemon told it, you would never know that Kurt Lemon was dead. He was still out there in the dark, naked, painted up, trick-or-treating, sliding from hooch to hooch in that crazy white ghost mask. But he was dead. I hope that story gives you a feel for a whole bunch of stuff, one of which is the craziness and absurdities of Vietnam. I hope it also gives you a feel for what I was aiming at, to give a sense of, through a freshly thought up story, As far as I know, there wasn't any trick-or-treating in Vietnam, because I didn't do any, of what it was when non-combatant violence was committed. Sometimes in very petty ways, trick-or-treating. Sometimes in very big and very violent ways. The most important, I hope the story gives you a feel, at least in small part, for the power of pretending. You almost forget, as you tell the story of, say, your dad or your mom, some day in your past, those people are gone from your lives now. Pretending, in a way, can keep the dead with us. Not their bodies, of course, but whatever it is that abides, the essence of what it is to be human, the essence of, in this case, Kurt Lemon. As I wait for my sons to awaken on this Wednesday morning in March of 2009, just before boarding that airplane for Minneapolis, I find myself more or less surrendering to tales, at least for the time being. As a father, I realize I have much to learn, or much to relearn, about the power of pretending. A few years back, my own father went away on a long trip. Went away for good. And like Timmy, I occasionally find myself caught up in a world of make-believe. I'll see my dad toss a baseball to me, or I'll hear him singing a few bars of "I'll Be Seeing You" in his clear, unforced baritone. And in those moments, my dad is back home again. I'm on my second cup of coffee now. A little sad, a little sentimental. Quietly watching the first twinklings of dawn spread out across the kitchen window. Human race, I realize, may have lost something when we shed our tails all those eons ago. But we gained something too. We learned to live not just in the unconscious present, the way chipmunks live, but we learned to live in a flow of history and in the possibilities of a miraculous future. True, we cannot bound skyward like Tigger with a thrust of our mighty tails. But we can close our eyes and fly into our Father's arms. This, I suppose, is why I've become a writer. Beyond anything, the events of recent weeks remind me that Timmy and Tad will themselves be in need of good, strong imaginations in the years ahead. After all, biology is implacable. People don't live forever. It's not a morbid thought, really. In fact, it's almost joyful. But I'm aware that on some future morning, such as this one, my sons may be awakening before dawn. They may brew up a pot of coffee, as I did, and sit dreaming at the kitchen table. Maybe they'll imagine me coming home from the airport. Maybe they'll see me opening up the front door and taking them in my arms and lifting them up high, a slinky dangling from my faded old blue jeans. Thank you. I'm the answer guy, you're the question guy, so. I don't know what I would ask of the novelist either, so don't feel bad if nothing pops into your mind. Yes? Question is, what did I study at McAllister? I majored in political science, but I did take a boatload of English classes. I mean, a lot of them, probably almost enough to major. And so I was sort of jointly studying government and writing. Yes?
Have you had any conversations with other Vietnam War vets about your novels? Like, what has their response been?
Question is if I had conversations with other Vietnam vets about my work. And the answer is yeah, I had a lot. For those who were in combat, I mean, Vietnam was not one homogenized thing. It was like almost as many wars as there were soldiers. Because what you go through depends on what your job is and where you are in the country and what year you're there. I mean, if you're, say, a clerk, you remember typing a lot. If you're an artillery guy, you remember loud artillery. If you're a helicopter pilot, you're looking down on a war. If you're a foot soldier, as I was, you're seeing little blades of grass. But if you, among combat veterans or guys who are out in the field, I think by and large they seem to like the books. More importantly, though, to me, are the conversations I've had with the sons and daughters and wives and mothers of Vietnam veterans who will say to me, my son or my husband or my father won't talk about it. And I felt that, through your book, I got some access to what is going on in that person's head. It's so silent. And those conversations are a lot more meaningful to me than those from veterans, because veterans know what they've been through. I don't have to tell them. They don't need me. But maybe their wives do, and maybe their kids do. I had a letter from somebody in Minneapolis, actually. This is not too long ago, in the last year. I can't paraphrase this without wrecking the letter, but it was from an elementary school teacher. God, I hope not in Hastings. But maybe, I can't remember. Maybe so. It said, Dear Tim OBrien, for years my dad didn't talk about the war. Our tension in my family, my mom and dad were having big trouble. And she said that as a little girl, she didn't understand the nature of the trouble. She thought if the house was just full of this endless tension, as if something were like a grenade would explode. Then she said when she got to college, she went to St. Olaf, and she introduced her dad to the things they carried, who read it. And for the first time, they began talking about his experience in the war, and where he articulated some of his feelings about what he'd gone through. The surprising part of the letter was that when she said, my dad suddenly looked at me and said, your mother never loved me. And to have that utterance come out of a man's mouth about a marriage, and having that utterance engendered by a book that I wrote, is an amazing thing, where that kind of honesty comes out of a work of literature. You don't expect that. So the touching thing about being a writer, in the end, really has little to do with Vietnam. It has more to do with the human heart, just in general. Yes, sir.
How do you find the strength to expose yourself to all of us in the way that you do in your novels? And you could also think of it as kind of an audacity.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's amazing what caffeine and cigarettes will do, for one thing. I mean, I'm a veteran smoker. The Army just got me started, and I haven't stopped. I got to find a way. Back in those days, for those of you in the audience who remember that era, cigarettes were like, okay. And not only okay, they were given to us free of charge in our C rations. That's how I started smoking. And one way or another, that war is going to kill me. That hasn't stopped yet. Less facetiously, my answer is that I don't have any choice. That I have one life to lead. I'm a writer, and I'm not going to lie. And so the choice is between trying to be guarded and talk around things. The way you hear things talked around in talk shows all the time, where you feel euphemisms are being used, and people are gliding to be polite around subjects. And literature is not a polite enterprise. Literature is an enterprise for truth-telling. As much as I don't like using, for example, dirty words in my private, real conversations, I'm not going to avoid them in a book about a war. Men are going to speak in my books the way they speak in wars, and if you don't like it, watch how you vote. Stop voting for wars, and you won't hear that kind of talk anymore, at least not as much. So that's how I feel about it. That my job is to be as honest as I can. So I don't feel like I have any choice. I don't look at it as audacity or courage. I just feel that that's what I would want to do with my life. Yes?
I was just wondering about some of the characters and things they carry. Are they actual people or are they, so they're actual people?
No, I'm nodding and I understand your question. The question was, are the people, the characters and the things that carry real people? And I nodded. The nod meant only that I understood the question. They're not actual people any more than Huck Finn is an actual person. But Huck Finn was based on a real person, that Mark Twain knew. Very loosely based, but nonetheless based. Yet, as a character grows, he or she becomes a different human being. Huck Finn never existed, his body. But everybody in this room, all you got to do is just close your eyes for just a second, and then you can see Huck doing something, if nothing else, going down a raft on a river. And that's the same thing I do when I remember my dad. Eyes closed, there comes the baseball. You remember your first girlfriend in high school or boyfriend. Close your eyes, and there he or she is again, doing whatever nasty thing he or she did to you to wreck your life forever. and that's the world we live in. The characters are all born out of real people I knew. They're just scraps of, not the real person, just scraps of who that person was. A memory here, a memory there, and then I make up the rest. And in the end, they become, for me, as real as any of you are. I'm going to leave you, go back to my hotel room, and your faces are going to slowly, pretty rapidly even dissolve. Whereas the faces in my books are going to remain with me because I just know them better than I know you. And I think all of you can understand that. But they're not real people. Yes?
Throughout the things they carry, sometimes you mentioned that a real war story doesn't need to have a moral or have a point. But then in this speech today, you talked a lot about gravitas and sort of importance of the story. So, how would you explain?
The question was there's a point in the things they carry. In fact, several points in the book where the author, I guess myself, says, that war stories don't have to have morals, and probably shouldn't, that they just exist. And if there's a moral to a story, you better distrust the story. It's too simple, or too simple-minded to have a moral. And then the other part of the question was, but now and then these characters in the books make morals out of some of these stories. And you're right. The problem is that I don't trust the morals that those characters are drawing from the story. That there's a morality, I hope through my books, but the morality is not one of lessons. Like, eat your oatmeal or you're going to have bowel problems. And fiction is not for that. It doesn't counsel you in how to live your life or not. Instead, we draw, as we lie in bed at night and we're reading a book that we admire and love, you're drawing something from the book that you can't quite put your finger on. Because if you could put your finger on it, it would be like drawing a thread out of a piece of cloth. And you draw it out, and there'd be no cloth left. The stories are the whole thing, the behavior and the dialogue and the scene. And if you start drawing a moral out of it, everything dissolves. It's a little bit like, scientists can take a molecule of water and they can take the oxygen out of it. And it can be done. But then it's not water, it's this full of gas. And it's not water anymore. And I feel a little bit the same way about morals and stories. I'd rather when I read stories I like, the most profound response I can have is, oh, wow, or something like that, as opposed to standing in front of, say, the Mona Lisa and dissecting the brushstrokes. I mean, you can do it, and it is done, but it's not inappropriate, and it's not unintelligent just to go, whoa, and feel your heart do something, which is what the artist finally wants. I don't write to be analyzed. I got, I don't know how many books written about me now, but enough to make me puke. Yeah, I haven't read any of them because my object is not to be analyzed. My goal is to be read and have something happen to somebody's stomach or throat or whatever, not to be analyzed. Yes.
There's a part in things they carried that when you're staying with your old man, when you're on the boat, and you were saying how you were you wanted to go to Canada, but you were too a coward, or yeah, you were a coward, you didn't have the strength to run away from the war, and because you were a coward, you were to fight the war. I thought that very interesting, like, as far as that would be the kind of opposite of what most people would consider. So I was wondering if that was actually how you felt about it, or was it kind of like a turn of phrase, or just kind of a clever way of looking at it, as duality of it?
No, I meant it pretty literally. I mean, there are points in the book that are just me talking, and that's one of them. That I made up the story on the Rainy River. I've never been there. I've been close, and I've been in northern Minnesota, but no Elroy, no Tip Top Lodge. Yeah, it's invented. But at the end of the book, at the end of the chapter, rather, when I don't know what the word is, ending the chapter, the line, I was a coward, I went to the war, is meant to strike back at John Wayne and this kind of standard mythologies of what courage is. It doesn't have to be just going to war. Courage can also be saying no to war. If you're doing what you think is the right thing and you take the consequences, that can be brave too. The fact of the matter is I was opposed to the war. I thought it was wrong. And I went anyway. Probably killed people. I certainly got wounded myself, and I watched a lot of other people die. And the right thing and the brave thing for me to have done would have been to say no. I didn't have the courage to say no. Now you can analyze it. You can say, well, I was young. I was 20 years old. And I would tell myself, God, Tim, you don't know everything. Maybe LBJ's right. You don't know all the CIA reports, and maybe there's some reason for the war you don't know about. Nonetheless, we all operate essentially in these informational with limitations. We don't know everything, and you still have to make choices, and you have to make the best choice based on what you know, how old you are, how smart you are. You do your best. And I was knowingly copping out. The truth is I was too embarrassed to say no. That's the bottom truth, which is I come from a small town, and I didn't want my dad and mom sitting in the Gobbler Cafe in downtown Worthington and listening to some farmer sitting behind him saying, hey, did you hear what the OBrien kid did? Sissy went to Canada. And I can imagine my dad's eyeballs meeting my mom's eyeballs and how they'd look at each other and the sadness they would feel. And I couldn't deal with that image in my head of being embarrassed in front of people in my hometown. So I went to the war, which on the surface, I guess, looks like a brave, thing to do. But in my case, I'm not saying everybody's this way, all the other soldiers. I'm talking about me. That was not a brave thing to do. I will submit to you, though, that among the guys I served with in Vietnam, very, very few of them went to that war to stop communism or to, help the Vietnamese toward democracy. They went to the war because everybody else was going, and it's hard to say no. The peer pressure's on you, and it's hard in our society to say no. Yes.
Is there a certain reason why the water buffalo scene stuck out
Yeah, the water buffalo scene is in this scene. For those of you who haven't read the book, there's a scene in which Rat Kiley shoots and shoots and shoots this little baby water buffalo, not to kill it, but to hurt it really badly. Shoots the ears, shoots the flanks, shoots the hooves, shoots the knees, shoots the ears off, shoots the nose, just shoots and shoots. Why is it there? A couple of reasons. Main reason is I wanted at least one passage in the book, and probably only one, to graphically and minute details slow things down the way they don't slow down on the Fox channel, the way they don't slow down on CNN, where you see moment by moment by moment the horror of it all. Instead of saying, as you'd hear on the Fox channel, 15 Marines died today in Fallujah, or whatever, that'd be the end of it. You're back at home, a chimpanzee bit somebody's face off. And that's how fast it goes. But to slow down, and I wanted to do it in a way that was this business I was talking about in my speech tonight, in some extraordinary way that we haven't seen before. Anybody who's seen a war story, a movie, read a book about war, is going to expect the deaths of human beings. That's going to be the pivotal emotional moment. But I wanted a moment that was different, that was out of the ordinary, that would stick to your memory the way it apparently stuck to yours. A baby water buffalo taking the brunt of it, a mere animal. And then to make you feel something, even though you may eat hamburgers every night, or every other night, and love your barbecue and your steaks, and even then make you feel something for this innocent victim of the war. So I needed a moment like that was somehow out of the ordinary. I also wanted to get to a point at which I wanted this character to say, that scene concludes with the character saying, well, that's Nam for you. Garden of Evil. Over here, man, every sin's real, fresh and original. The play off of Garden of Eden, Garden of Evil. And then to say, over here, man, and Nam, every sin is real, fresh and original. Meaning, if you do it, the sin is brand new to you. There may have been a trillion murders in the past, but if you do one, murder's fresh, and it's original. It's original to you. The way war felt to me, and to all my fellow soldiers in Vietnam. There have been thousands of wars in the past, millions of dead. But to us, and to soldiers right now in Iraq and Afghanistan, I can promise you, it's fresh, and it's original. And it's never happened before. Not for them. And I wanted to get to that point with that baby water buffalo scene. Maybe time for one more question. I think. I've lost track of time. Okay, way up there.
What was your most memorable chapter in the things they carry?
Couldn't hear that. What was that?
Your most memorable chapter in the things
Most
they
memorable?
carry?
For me, the one that I guess means the most to me now, it didn't at the time, but now it does, is the last chapter. Because it's one of the few chapters in the book that's really, really rooted in reality. It zooms out of the real world, but it starts in a real experience of a little girl I knew when I was in 4th grade. I loved her, and she loved me. And then she died. She had a brain tumor. And I recount this story about little Linda out of my life in Worthington. And near the end of the story, the Timmy character wakes her up in imagination and asks her, what's it like to be dead? The way I'd like to wake up my father and say, what's it like to be dead? I'd like to wake up some of my friends from Vietnam and say, what's it like? All these years, you've missed all this life, you died when you were 20, what's it like? And she says, in the book, the character says, well, it's not so bad. It's like being in a book that nobody has read in a long, long time. You're up in a library shelf, and you haven't been checked out. But then, one day, somebody wanders up the dusty aisle and reaches up, takes you off the shelf, opens you up, starts reading. And there you are again. Wearing your little red stocking cap and ice skating, which I think is pretty much how memory works for all of us. You know, months and years can go by and you won't think about that first grade teacher of yours or whatever, and then something will happen and you check her out for a minute out of the library, and there she is again, smiling at you or wrapping your fingernails or whatever it is she did. And there she is, and she goes back into the library of memory. Well, that chapter was published in a magazine before it appeared in the book, an Esquire magazine. And about a month later, I got a letter in the mail, the longest letter I've ever received, or second longest. It was written on, you know that old computer paper that used to have little holes in the end? I don't know what you call it, but yeah, this was like a football field letter. It came from the girl's mother, the real little girl who was the model for the character in the book. She had left Worthington soon after the death of her little girl and had moved to Arizona, I think to Phoenix, possibly Tucson, but I think Phoenix. And she said she was sitting in a dentist's office one day, waiting to get drilled. And she picked up Esquire, and it was just lying there, and she saw my name on the cover, so she knew I was from Worthington. She knew I'd taken her little girl to the movies when we were in 4th grade. And she started reading the story, and there suddenly was her little girl. She said in her letter that the mother thought that she was the last person on the planet to remember that little girl. She'd been dead for 40 years, longer, 44 years. And she said her husband was gone and all her relatives were gone. She was living alone, and she thought I was the last bearer of memory of this pretty little girl who was gone all this time. And to be sitting in a dentist's office, to open up this page and see her daughter talking, literally recreating the book image of the book. That is, that thing about I'm going to live inside a book. Here she's in a magazine. It's just happening in a dentist's office. So she said she put the magazine down, didn't get drilled, went home, wrote me the letter. So you can see in answer to your question why that story takes on special meaning for me. Not just because of the emotional stuff of the letter, but because it's what I was writing about. That was what I wanted to do in this book, was to give, not to return life to these people who were long gone, all my friends in Vietnam. I couldn't do that. But I could make them live in a different way, the way all of us are eventually going to live, which is on the pages of memory, those that love us and survive us. It happens with books all the time. That was what was most moving about that story for me. I want to say thank you to my hosts here at Hastings. It's been a great stay. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on such a really cruddy night to come see me. Thank you.
With a pretty basic question. Why did you start writing?
I started writing largely because I'd always wanted to be a writer from the time I was, 9 or 10 years old. But then my life collided with Vietnam, and instead of wanting to write, I felt I had to write. I couldn't imagine not writing about the experience of being drafted to fight a war I didn't believe in, didn't like, and the aftermath of having been a soldier in Vietnam.
And why did you want to come and speak to Hastings?
Well, I was invited to come. I didn't just show up on the doorstep. But well, for one thing, I'm from Minnesota, so I wanted to return to my home state. I live in Texas now, so it'd be a great, way to get back to Minnesota. And on top of that, the subject matter of war in Vietnam seems to apply to the world we're living in today. With 2 wars going on, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, that in many, 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 many ways are eerily similar to what I went through, 3 or 4 decades ago.
And can you tell me who invited you here and how that all worked out?
I was invited by Carrie Jaeger, who teaches here at the high school, Hastings High School, and we had a correspondence by email, and I was finally persuaded to come, and here I am.
And have you talked to any students here?
Yeah, I've talked to students, not at length, but I signed books this afternoon after talking to the high school, kind of a big auditorium, and spoke to several students, yeah.
And what kind of responses have you heard from them about your work?
Oh, it's great. It was, they seemed to like books, and they seemed to like my book, so I was happy.
And what advice would you have for any aspiring writers?
It's always tough to give advice, because no one ever listens to it anyway, but in general, I'd say if you want to be a writer, you better be a reader. So reading widely and maybe now and then paying attention to what it is you like or don't like in books you're reading, and do the things you like and don't do the things you don't. A writer almost always thinks of himself, even as you're writing, as a reader. You imagine yourself reading along, even as you're writing something, asking yourself, would I like what's happening? Would I be interested? Would I laugh? Would I feel when my heart feels squeezed? So I think a good writer always thinks of himself or herself as a good reader. On top of that, another good piece of advice is if you want to be a writer, don't forget to write a little bit.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.